Good afternoon, everybody. I think we'll just go ahead and get started. I do want to make sure that everybody can hear me okay. Can someone drop a line in the chat or give me a thumbs up? Awesome. Thank you, Allison. Awesome. Well, I'm really excited to be here today. Thanks for joining me on your lunch break. I know times are busy, so I definitely appreciate your time. And do want to kind of just jump in and get started. So a little bit about me. My name is Sarah Matlock, and I'm a faculty member in the Equine Sciences program at Colorado State University. So in about 2017, I was tasked with building our behavior curriculum for our undergraduate students. We recognized that a lot of our students coming into the program had little horse experience. They loved horses, wanted a career with them, but didn't really have a background. And so understanding behavior became really important. And so I currently teach the Applied Equine Behavior Foundation course for our students and a safety and handling lab that's associated with that course. So by design, this course is really meant to help students understand the innate needs of horses, as well as the breakdown in communication that can often occur during handling and training, and even in management, that often contributes to problem and or dangerous behaviors. So in addition to my teaching, I'm also passionate about conducting research centered on equine behavior and welfare, particularly relating to learning theory, motivation, and equine emotional states. So my true mission is to improve human-animal interactions by helping others to better understand the emotional and physical needs of the horse and how compromising those needs affects the human-animal bond. So my previous work includes low-stress methods for gentling mustangs, assisting with the development of a behavior tracking tool for management and training, and early identification of stress in horses that are integrated into various human services. So like I mentioned, I'm really passionate about that human animal bond but really honestly increasing optimism in horses by building these stronger and safer relationships. So a little bit about my work. My passion for improving that human-animal interaction led me to digging deeper into learning theory and behavioral indicators. And this was really triggered by a program that we have known as the Right Horse Program at CSU. So each semester we have horses from local rescues enter our program, and our students, as part of that class, work to rehabilitate and retrain these horses to better prepare them for adoption, for successful adoption. But due to previous trauma, many of these horses are shut down and don't really respond well to traditional methods of training. They often also do not have any motivation to try and connect with people. So despite your best efforts, they pretty much just avoid, and they're compliant. They'll do what you ask, but they don't really care about getting connected. So this kind of led me on a path to really understand, how do horses learn without utilizing fear, and how can we improve their trust and connection in that process? So that was the Mustang study. Working with a nonprofit, we had 15 freshly gathered, ungentled Mustangs that participated in this study. And we were really looking at the least intrusive, minimally aversive methods in gentling. More specifically, we wanted to know the efficacy and impacts of using clicker training, which is a form of positive reinforcement, as the primary tool for training. This study taught me so much about how horses learn and how we can best use behavioral indicators to keep them under threshold, and how we can also best create a trusting and willing partnership when we remove fear from the training process. I could probably spend a whole presentation on this study. It's kind of my passion project, but I'll move on. So with the growth in popularity of human equine interactions in human health, I also wanted to better understand the impacts of this type of work on the welfare and well-being of the horse. So initially, I wanted to better understand what type of behavioral indicators of stress we might see. Previous research in this area only really looked at riding school horses in various programs, and not really at horses that were in human services. So in 2021, at the Temple Grandin Equine Center, we did an observational study over the course of 10 weeks to identify common stress-related behaviors specific to this context. So from these repeated observations, we identified 14 potential indicators of negative stress, and this served to sort of build our ethogram. which I'll share shortly. So this was then used to code behaviors in a later study with different horses at a different site. And we saw excellent consistency, meaning the same 14 behaviors we noticed in Temple Grandin Equine Center horses were also commonly exhibited at a different facility. So this study that we did was designed to determine the impacts of the participants' emotional state on the stress of the horse. And we'll have the results of this study available next year. So I'm finishing that manuscript, but I'm excited to show what we found. I will say, kind of as a spoiler, the good news is that there's a growing body of research, including in that study, providing pretty good evidence that this type of work does not cause undue stress to horses, especially when compared to other types of equine activities. However, as we will discuss in a bit, this does not mean that our horses are not experiencing any negative stress. And as providers and equine managers, it's our job to be able to identify when and why our horses might be experiencing adversity during our sessions. So, as most of you might know, as the traditional relationship between humans and horses has evolved, so has the extent of this benefit. So there's been great attention given to the profound benefits to human health from this partnership with horses, which has led to an incredible influx of rigorous research, specifically looking at the efficacy of various interventions in an equine environment. It's also been really well documented that non-therapeutic interactions can enhance psychosocial well-being of humans with positive benefits, including increased social interactions, social emotional function, and even decreased symptoms of anxiety and depression. So it's no surprise that this field is the fastest growing sector of the equine industry with incredible exposure and diversity. But with this exciting growth and increasing recognition, for some, the focus has really shifted to the well-being of the horse. As I previously mentioned, despite the growing field of research evaluating the benefits to humans, there's still very little data unpacking the effects of this type of work on the horse. So this general lack of published work means we know very little about the unique challenges and concerns these horses might face. Furthermore, based on anecdotal evidence and preliminary work, there's pretty high horse turnover and behavioral issues, which seem to be a common problem within this field. To exacerbate the issue and probably tell us a little bit more of the story, a recent study was done of horse selection, longevity, and retirement conducted by Rankins et al. And they found that horses between the ages of 16 to 20 years of age represented the greatest percentage of service horses, suggesting many of these horses are actually in their second or third careers. What does that mean? It probably means they have some arthritis or chronic soundness issues as the result of later career horses. This survey also showed that behavioral issues as well as unsoundness were the leading causes of retirement. So horse isn't feeling well, they show some behaviors, and they're not appropriate for the session, they get removed. Accordingly, being able to identify subtle signs of negative stress is really important. Ignoring these subtle signs may not only lead to bigger problem behaviors during sessions, but they also compromise equine well-being. So it's important to understand that all behavior is for a reason, and it's our job and duty to not only understand equine behavior, but also be able to identify its pathology and function in order to select the appropriate response and possible intervention. So this right here is the key to the long-term success and sustainability of horses in this work. Our standard of practice and care should not be based simply on preventing poor welfare. Rather, we should strive for positive indicators of welfare and well-being during sessions. So this is so important to understand because this type of work brings diverse attention from the general public more than ever before. The equine industry has long since been under the radar of society's critical eye. So think about the public's highly emotional responses to like horse slaughter or horse racing, rodeos within the past just few decades. When animals are involved, society can be highly engaged in their welfare and raise quick and deliberate flags against any industry that seems to undermine the animal's well-being. This social license to operate is essentially the public or society's acceptance, which grants permission or a license, if you will, to undertake its activity. Interestingly enough, there's already been some criticism over the welfare of horses in this line of work, with some claiming that mechanical horses should be used over live horses. Now, I think we can all argue in this room that there's significant benefits to humans from the live human horse interaction, but this will not be sufficient for that social license. So now is the time, more than ever before, that we get ahead of any potential issues by really investigating specific problems these horses might face, while also developing ways to promote positive well-being for these horses. Just as research is conducted to evaluate the efficacy of these human services, we should always be doing research to improve the well-being, motivation, and cognitive bias of the horses that are integrated. So, a little bit of background. Before we jump in to discuss potential indicators of stress, it's really important to recognize the impact of historical training and management practices on equine welfare and well being. Because honestly, these practices set the stage for behavior, the same behaviors that might show up in your sessions. Recent research in equitation sciences has actually provided really invaluable insight into what was once considered common thought. So, first, the concept of dominance, hierarchy, which was actually adopted from the observations that horses in nature establish this predictable social hierarchy. And so it's led to this assumption that humans should strive to attain superior rank, to prevent and correct problem behaviors and sort of achieve this compliance. So these attempts to achieve control often encourage and justify the application of aversive training methods in order to gain that control. And as a consequence, the research shows that the predominant reaction of most horses is to avoid the trainer or handler, or show increased flight responses or defensive or avoidance behaviors. Or in the worst cases, we have horses that just simply shut down to pressure altogether. In other species, such as the dog, the dominance hierarchy approach has been largely replaced by explaining these dominant behaviors from more scientifically sound learning principles. So, in other words, animals are most often unintentionally reinforced by their handlers for these unwanted behaviors and not actually trying to assert any type of dominance over them. To compound the issue, researchers have also found that errors in pressure release account for major behavior problems. So these include conflict behaviors that we often see under saddle. For example, bucking, rearing, bolting are most commonly tied to improper use of the rider's aids, improper use of negative reinforcement. Although these behaviors are rare in our horse population, we can still see the consequence of improper use of negative reinforcement by the prevalence of horses that fail to respond to cues. When horsemanship focuses on control rather than reinforcement, we have to rely too heavily on each handler's own ability to force this compliance, which we all know is not always successful. Reinforcement, on the other hand, draws on principles of learning theory, which serves to increase the likelihood that the horse will respond to cues from anyone. It's often this misconception of using control versus reinforcement that often causes so many handler issues during sessions. What I often see in this population of horses is horses who've actually downregulated their senses to pressure because pressure just has lost its value as a reinforcer. On a final note, often a consequence of creating that bomb proofed horse during training actually shuts down their emotional expressions. So, horses that exhibit fear or maybe even just confusion related behaviors during training are often mislabeled as being dominant or disrespectful, and therefore met with punishment or even just stronger training practices, sort of forcing them to do it. Over time, horses suppress their emotional state out of fear of being punished. This can actually lead to sudden blow-ups in behavior that we perceive to be out of nowhere. On the other hand, allowing and responding to these low level, non threatening behavior indicators of stress is really effective in preventing a dangerous escalation. But we do have to show our horses that they're allowed to tell us when they're not sure about something. Sorry, the slide is not transitioning. There we go. Okay, so as we kind of jump into those behavioral indicators, it's really important to recognize those low level indicators of stress or tension and to understand threshold. So, just like in humans, when a horse feels relaxed and safe, it's most likely under control of the parasympathetic nervous system. And behaviors associated with this activity include relaxed facial expressions, relaxed head and neck positioning, frequent waffles, for example, and slow and rhythmic blinking and breathing. So kind of think just like people, parasympathetic activity is that rest and digest. This state is counteracted by the sympathetic nervous system, which governs the state of high alert that urges that fight or flight or freeze response in horses. So when a horse encounters a trigger, the sympathetic nervous system releases stress hormones, right? Just like in people. And this endocrine and nervous system response is really responsible for the flight response we see in horses. An engaged sympathetic nervous system heightens the senses, diverts blood to the muscles, and increases blood pressure and breathing rate, essentially all behavioral indicators. And that activation prepares the horse to face or escape from danger. So the balance between the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system is really crucial to a horse's behavioral health. Understanding the triggers for an activated social or sympathetic nervous system can help you maintain healthy behavioral responses in your horses. Kind of going back to that, their ability to show you low-level signs of stress, those low-level emotional stages, or kind of that lower level, is a lot safer than waiting until they actually blow up, right? So it's important to note that some activation of the sympathetic nervous system is actually necessary for levels of activity and for learning. After all, we don't really want our horses falling asleep during services, right? Although I will say that some oftentimes seem like they are. But we also don't want chronic or hyper elevated, hyper vigilant horses that have such high elevated activation, because this is synonymous with that chronic stress. It's really important that we find that balance in services where our horses are alert, paying attention, proactive, and compliant, yet not holding tension, bracing, avoiding, or balking. This difference lies in the emotional, physical, and mental states of your horse. And all of those components can mean the difference between negative stress that the horse might be experiencing or just simply neutral stress, which is part of being active. So these behavioral indicators of elevated activation or negative stress include initial signs of tension, like rapid blinking or a look away, which would be an avoidance behavior. Maybe it's a displacement behavior, like they start eating dirt, they start eating soil or eating poop that's on the floor in the arena. So think of a displacement behavior as a conflict of how they're feeling emotionally. I feel a little stressed, I feel a little tension, but I also feel a little more pro-social. So that'll often be be exhibited as a displacement behavior. And those are all signs of coming into feelings of distress. Whereas like licking and chewing, for example, or lowering of the head, maybe even a neck shake, these can all be signs of coming out of feelings of distress, or a better way to say that they would be releasing tension, for example. So if that tension is unresolved, for example, the mental pressure or maybe pain increases, then horses will exhibit redirected, frustrated, avoidance, and misplaced behaviors. So going higher up on that chain of tension. If the tension persists, horses become right at threshold, so right under threshold with more animated, emotionally fear-based responses. And finally, the ultimate response to unresolved tension is over threshold, fight, flight responses. Within this category, we often see dangerous escape or conflict behaviors, like I mentioned earlier, bucking, rearing, bolting. And horses are not in an appropriate mental state to really learn their way out of it, but rather simply are reacting from fear, pain, or pressure. So due to the calm nature and temperament of this specific horse population, chronic tension and stress will often remain within the tension and unresolved tension categories. But again, this does not mean that the tension and stress is any less important or significant than horses that are easily sent over threshold. It just means that they have a higher behavioral tolerance for handling negative stress. Unfortunately, everyone has their limits, and unresolved tension will eventually trigger stack its way into a progression of behavioral issues. So, for example, when those repeatedly ignored bite threats turn into actual bites. A lot of times what we see with our horses that are integrated in human services, especially since they're second, third career horses, a lot of issues we see are pain related. And so they might have chronic pain due to arthritis, for example. And when they are dealing with pain and trying to manage that pain, it can create sort of disassociation from the environment around them, downregulation of their senses. We'll talk a little bit about how to identify that behaviorally in just a bit, but I think it's important to understand that a horse that's dealing with chronic pain can really go from that tension, unresolved tension, straight to the fight or flight response pretty quickly, just because of the pain that they might be experiencing. And it's really no different when your threshold, your triggers are much more reactive when you're also dealing with some type of pain. So this is the ethogram that I mentioned earlier, and these were the frequent indicators of negative stress in this population, which is listed on this ethogram. So for example, a bite threat, which is defined simply as a slight turn of the head towards the handler. The mouth can be open or closed, it doesn't matter. But when this behavior is paired with pinned ears, it's an increased warning. The mouth doesn't have to be open, like I mentioned, in either case. And in our pilot study, this behavior was most frequently observed during tacking and tightening in the cinch. It should be noted that when observing behavioral indicators, ears pinned is an active ear pin and not a chronic disposition, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But we want to notice the difference between expressive ears, like the ears in movement, and then from an expressive ear to a pinned ear versus just like chronically held back. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But another interesting behavior to point out is the itching of the head or neck. So this can actually be a sign of a release of tension when done chronically in sessions. Horses that exhibit a neck or head itch most often will itch the same spot routinely. And anecdotally, we've seen it happen after gait transitions while at a standstill. I also want to take a note of the licking and chewing, because this is oftentimes misconstrued in the equine industry. So historically, it was believed that licking and chewing meant the horse might have learned something in that moment, or that it's now relaxed, it's in a good headspace. But what we now know, it's that it is simply a release of tension. That's it. So chronic licking and chewing is an indication of chronic tension or chronic movement along, like we saw earlier, that scale of tension in the body. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily feeling better. It doesn't mean that they necessarily learned something. It's just a release in that moment. And then I also want to take a note to the behavior of the tail swoosh. So obviously this could be due to the irritation of flies, right? If it's in the summertime, you're going to see a lot of tail swooshes. It doesn't mean that your horse is showing you indicators of stress. But it can be indication of tension, particularly when you chronically see it at gait transitions or during saddling and cinching. This can be an indication of tension. So it's important to note that we'd expect to see some signs of tension and release of tension as a normal part of being alive, right? And as a normal part of physical activity. But what we're watching for specifically are chronic behaviors, things that we see chronically that are oftentimes associated with some type of routine activity during service. And there's your indicator that there's an underlying issue. Finally, it's also important to note that just like in people, horses can develop unique behavioral signs that actually may not be routinely exhibited by other horses. So, but nonetheless, it's still an indicator of stress for that specific horse. For example, in our study that we did looking at the emotional dysregulation of the participants, we actually noted that one specific horse had a chronic lip wiggle associated with a certain activity. So that was a unique behavior that we coded that wasn't seen in other horses, but was an indication of tension in that horse particularly. So sort of that baseline of each individual horse, just like in people, is really important to understand. What is their go-to sign of tension or symptom of tension in their own body? And what is their baseline state of relaxation? And how can we compare that to a more tense facial expression, for example, or the type of behavior that they use to indicate that something might be wrong? So this is an example of that ethogram in action, and is a really great illustration of chronic behaviors observed versus just like normal behaviors during saddling at the tie rail. So horse number one on the left-hand side, within a 4-minute time frame during active saddling, we saw 3 head tosses, we saw 7 licks and chews, we saw 7 lowering of the head and neck, and 7 pawing, 5 step forward and step back, and then 1 tail swoosh. Whereas horse 2 on the right side of this chart, within that same 4-minute time frame during active saddling, only exhibited 4 head tosses and 1 lick and chew. And what was interesting, after we did this pilot study, this observational study, we found that horse number 1 had ulcers. So the key takeaway from this is that all behavior is for a reason, and chronic behavior is an indication of an underlying problem. It would be very easy for us to dismiss those behaviors as them being bored at the tie rail, or just simply not wanting to go to work that day. But as being responsible for their welfare and well-being, it's important that we understand those behaviors are always for a reason, and it's our job to investigate it. So now let's take a closer look at some facial expressions so you can get some practice with what I've been talking about, and discuss sort of that idea of chronic position versus acute positions. The ears are such a great indicator of mental state, and I always look at the chronic position of ears when I'm doing behavior evaluations. It's important to note, you may or may not know this, horses actually have 16 muscles in their ears, which allows for 180-degree movement. And that allows for them to isolate sounds so that they can localize or, tell where they came from. So a healthy mental state of the horse would have very expressive ears all the time. They're going to be paying attention to their surroundings, but they're also going to be paying attention to you and the participant on their back. So I want to see those ears expressive. I want to see them checking in with you, checking in with the rider, checking in with the horse, the sidewalkers, checking in with their environment, making sure that they're paying attention. So when I say expressive ears, it means they're in movement. They're using those 16 muscles to stay interacting with the environment around them. Now that's going to be versus a chronic ear position, which can be an indication of something deeper going on. So let's look at these pictures a little bit closer. Up in the right-hand corner, we see that chronic ear position back, right? And so it's not a true laid back ear, like an angry horse, an upset horse, a frustrated horse, defensive horse. They may press their ears back to their head. But this horse, it's actually a chronic position. So through the entire 45-minute riding session, they pretty much keep their ears in that chronic position. Ear back in that position can mean several different things, but it definitely means something. So I would want to explore if this horse is in current pain of any kind, frustration of any kind, fear of any kind. But at the very least, I know that they are escalated in that sympathetic activation to a point that they are excluding the world around them, not paying attention to their life, to the world around them, because they're so hyper-focused on whatever's creating that discomfort. Another one to keep in mind is the sleepy, unengaged, depressed looking ear. So that's our umbrella ear or airplane ears on the bottom left-hand side. I see these pretty chronically in services with horses. Where they're not using a bit, interestingly enough. And so again, this can mean a number of things. We oftentimes see this ear position when horses are napping out in the pasture. We can also see this position in horses that are depressed. So horses that are stalled longer than a 24-hour period, they don't get a lot of turnout, they're isolated. We can see this sort of chronic ear position. There's little really understood about what it might mean, and I don't really want to just kind of spit out my hypotheses, but I will say what it tends to show is that a horse who has that kind of unengaged ear, that umbrella ear or airplane ear, is disengaged with the environment. So they've actually sort of tuned out to the world around them, even though they're still cooperating, still performing, still doing what you need. So I think it's important, like this could be a positive thing for horses that are integrated into human services if the way they sort of cope with this lack of stimulation, this lack of enriching environment, because it's, kind of this repeat thing they're doing over and over again, is to kind of just check out and go with the flow, then that could be a positive thing for the horse. But if it could be an indication of something a little deeper, maybe a little bit of depression or a little bit of sleepiness, I think it's important to investigate this a little further. And then the last one is going to be that defensive, guarded, or annoyed look. And that's going to be where we see that more expressive pinned ear. And I see this a lot with all types of horses, but this isn't going to be a chronic ear position. This is going to be something that is the direct result of something you're doing. So you're tightening the cinch and you get an ear pin, or the rider's about to mount and you get an ear pin, or you touch their girth area and you get an ear pin. These are all indications of defensiveness, guardedness, annoyance, protectiveness, and should be diagnosed accordingly. So we shouldn't just assume that they're being disrespectful or dominant or unhappy, they don't like what they're doing, being lazy. Those are all anthropomorphic terms that don't really allow us to diagnose a deeper issue. So it's important to take note of those. And then I also love to look at the equine eye. It's another part of the face that really struggles to hide pain, anxiety, and fear, or distress, or just simple distress. So we look at three primary areas of the eye for these indicators. Qualitatively, just from a general assessment, we can assess the eyelid shape and the amount of wrinkles that are above the eyelid. So if we see sort of that chronic worried eye, it can be an indication of chronic pain, chronic anxiety, and distress. So in that bottom right-hand corner, you'll see that angle that we're looking for. And when you see that sort of 90-degree angle out of the horse's eye, that's sort of that general worried shape. And then how much worry we're looking at will depend on how much wrinkles or how much really pressure is being put on the eyelid as the horse is starting to feel more tension. So you can see no wrinkle, it's nice and soft and round, kind of that almond shaped, versus that strong, really 90-degree angle of that top eyelid with several wrinkles associated with that. And then also we can determine whether there's the presence of white in the horse's eye, which is an indication of them being right at or over threshold. So think that kind of fight, flight, or freeze response. Now, we probably don't see that as much in our population of horses, but it's really good to notice when your horse's eye has widened, which is oftentimes associated with fear or just really not sure what's about to happen. And then again, the key to this with looking at tension in the eye is to be able to identify chronic tension in the eye as a symptom of underlying problem. And that is really what can help you diagnose certain behaviors that are showing up in session. So we have certain behaviors showing up paired with chronic tension in the eye gives us a good indication that something deeper is going on. And then another part of the face that I love to look at is the mouth. So within this context, we don't normally see quite a bit of animation of the mouth as we might see with horses that are bitted, so like in a riding program. But the mouth, including the nostrils, the chin, and the lips, oftentimes will be the first sign of elevated activation. So when a horse starts to feel tension, either from an external or internal sensory input, they'll actually like hold that tension in their jaw by clenching their jaw. So that clenched jaw can actually, the greater the tension is, it can be really visible from the chin all the way up to the cheek, as seen in this picture in the center on the bottom here. And you can see the straining of the muscles all along from the point of his mouth all the way up to his cheekbone. The greater the degree of strain, the more significant the problem is when we're looking at a chronic behavior. Licking and chewing is the direct result of the horse releasing that tension in their jaw, like I mentioned earlier. So it doesn't mean that the horse thinks the danger has necessarily passed, or they're not in pain anymore, or they're not struggling anymore. It just means that they're able to release some of that tension they're holding in that body, down-regulate their nervous system a little bit, to come down a little bit sympathetically. But it's really easy to re-trigger that horse back into a state of hyper tension. And then on the contrary, what I love to see when we're thinking of that parasympathetic activity is yawning. Yawning is a much better indication of the horse reaching homeostasis within the nervous system. And you probably you don't often see yawning until you're done, right? You're at the tie rail at the end of the day, you've taken the headgear off, you've taken the saddle off, and the horse knows the session is over. They're anticipating going back to their pen, so they start to do some yawning to fully release the tension in their body and reset their nervous system back to parasympathetic activity. So I want to look at some of these pictures with you all so you can start to identify signs of tension yourself. If we look at this picture and this was a chronic state, we can see that the horse's ears are slightly pinned back, and with a meaning potentially distress, potential pain, potential defensiveness. You can definitely see the arc in the horse's eye, that 90-degree angle above the eyelid. If you can see where the eyelid isn't soft and round, it's not that soft almond shape. We've got that 90-degree angle. You can see the tension in the jaw. So from the cheekbone straight to the lips, we see all the muscles activated in that jawline, but we also see all the muscles activated from the ear to the eye. So that's another area of indication of tension. So if we see this chronic head head position, this chronic emotional expression in a horse's face during sessions, and it's not relaxing, this is an indication that there's an underlying problem. I want you to pay attention to the nose, how we have a puckered top lip, and we have sort of a grimace. We've got an elongated nostril. If you can see the elongation of that nostril, it should be soft, it should be round, the lip should be soft, but this is clearly a face that's representing tension. Now, this could also be a face that gets upset with another horse as they're passing by. And that's why it's really important that we're looking at chronic facial expressions versus acute facial expressions at something that just happened, and then they go back to having a nice relaxed face. I like this picture because we do see some more softness in the eye compared to that other picture. We see that umbrella ear or airplane ear, which is normally, like I mentioned, it can be sleepiness, it can be sort of disassociation, but it's normally surrounding a more relaxed state of mind. And then we can see a softer bottom lip, but we do see a little bit pucker of the nose going on, and that just could be an emotional response to being pet in that moment. It looks like the participant is about to pet or has just petted his face, so it could be a response to petting. And I think it's important to pay attention to the behavioral response when a horse is being pet on the face. Most horses actually don't like to be pet on the face, believe it or not. They don't prefer it. And if you notice, in feral populations, they don't go around mutually grooming each other's faces, right? So they're pretty protective of their face. They also have the vibrissae, which is those long hairs you see in the muzzle and the eyes that have their own rich sensories inputs in the brain. And so they're highly sensitive, almost like fingertips, like think of whiskers on a cat. And so that information can kind of be sensory overload, especially if we sort of demand that we're petting them on the face. So I'll pet horses on the face that seem to love it. They get the itchies on and they enjoy it. But if I have horses that exhibit more avoidance behaviors, more of that sort of head away, turn away, step forward, step back when you're trying to pet their face, I think that's a good indication that they don't necessarily enjoy it. I love this picture because if you can see both images in this picture, no, sorry, this one only has one. Just kidding. If you, what I love about this picture is you can actually see the head raise, right? So this rider is bending forward as part of their exercise, as part of their intervention. They're leaning forward, and as a result, the horse's head is raised, his ears are slightly back, he has a little bit of a worried eye and a little bit of tension. If this was an acute behavior, I wouldn't be worried at all because the horse is saying, I'm aware that the rider is doing something different. My ears are on the rider, my head is up because I'm bracing that things have moved on my back. So I'm bracing a little bit for that movement on my back. And I'm a little worried, I have a little bit of tension because I'm not sure what they're doing. But if within a few seconds this behavior resolves, we get a release of tension like a lick and chew, I'm not worried about this behavior at all. This should be a normal response to movement or activity on their back. If this is a chronic state, though, it would tell me that this horse is not able to come out of this feeling of tension, and that's where we would want to investigate it a little bit further. This is another really good picture. You can see that it's hard to see the rider on their back, but there is a rider on their back. But if you look at this horse's face close up, we see the umbrella ears. We see the classic 90-degree angle in the horse's eye. We see a puckered upper lip, but a relaxed lower lip. So I would want to look at the tension in the eye to the ear a little bit closer. I'd want a better picture of that. And I'd want to look at the tension from the mouth to the cheekbone a little bit. Notice that there is a bit in this horse's mouth. And so oftentimes we will see different types of behaviors in the mouth associated with pressure from the bit. And so it's important to kind of note that and how the face does look different when there's a bit in their mouth. It's interesting to note, without causing any undue discussions, I guess, that oftentimes we'll use the bit as a form of compliance. In other words, horses will behave better if there's a bit in their mouth, even if we're not actively using the bit, and it is because of an association of what that bit means for the horse. The problem with that, though, is that the bit can mask other underlying issues. So if your horse is expressing behaviors that we're not comfortable with, so we use a bit in order to mask those behaviors, all we're doing is shutting down their low-level behaviors, their low-level ways of telling us something is wrong. So for me, I would rather, instead of using a bit to sort of mask those behaviors or stop those behaviors, I'd rather sort of investigate, why is my horse failing to move forward when we're asking them to walk? Or why are they failing to stop when we're trying to stop? Why are they doing a little bit of a bite threat when we are having sidewalkers do some movement on the side with the participant? Those are questions I would want to investigate rather than maybe directly going to a tool to try and change that behavior. And then this one is a really good example too of tension in the face. Again, this horse does have a bit in their mouth, which could be part of that tension, but we see the ears slightly back. So this is not umbrella. This is a slightly back position. So if we're seeing this position chronically during sessions, this would be something that I would want to investigate a little bit. We can see the worried eye, a little bit softer, not as much on the horses before, but we do see tension in the eyebrow. So from the eye leading up to the ear, which is probably from the ear position, pulling the tension back in the ears. We can see definite tension in the mouth though. So you see the puckered top and bottom lip. You can see the elongated nostril, and this would be indication of just tension. And I still definitely want to reiterate, we're really looking at chronic behavior versus acute behavior. So if just taking a snapshot picture is definitely not a good way to assess overall emotional states during sessions, because like I said, we don't know if this is a response to just one acute thing happening in the moment, or is this more of a chronic feeling over time. So it's important to note that observing for signs of stress is not the same thing as diagnosing. Most of the time, practitioners and horse handlers are not in a position to diagnose what might be the root cause of a behavior. And we can slip into a really dangerous space if we're jumping to conclusions about why horses are behaving the way that they are. So, diagnosing behavior is actually a systematic process, and oftentimes it includes a detailed history of the horse, a veterinary exam to rule out any kind of underlying pain, and a management assessment. So, how are we meeting their five domains? We'll dive deeper in this in future topics, or and maybe another lunch and learn if you're interested. But I just think it's really important to understand that when we're interacting with horses, our responsibility is to identify behavioral indicators to inform the way we interact in the moment, not to create a massive diagnostic reason why it's happening, right? Because that's just a dangerous space. So I am happy to discuss in the future how I go about learning more about why a horse is behaving the way they are. And then there's also a whole nother presentation on what we can do. What are some interventions to improve welfare and well-being of these horses when they are showing us these symptoms? But for now, I think it's just really important to notice when we're having issues so that we can respond accordingly. So I think that's it. Definitely can open it up to questions if anybody has any questions. Hi, Lindsay. That's definitely probably a question for the AHA education team, but I do know it is being recorded. I can follow up with Amanda on that one. Great question, Melanie. So when I do a behavior assessment, how long does that typically take? So it depends on the symptom of the behavior. So it depends on what the extreme of the behavior is. If I can find out a history of the horse within a session with a horse manager, and that includes training history. So the things that are really important to understand when we're doing a behavior assessment, just like in people, right? We have to understand how they're being managed in their home life, what's happening at home, and are we meeting innate needs? So are we meeting their need for forage? Are we meeting their need for friendship? So that social aspect. Are they with other horses? Are we meeting their need for freedom? Are they constricted in their movement? Those types of things. So those are all really important to understand, and we have to kind of unpack before we move forward with the actual retraining of the behavior. But first and foremost, we always always rule out pain. So there's diagnostic tools that I can use when I'm evaluating horses that can tell me where the pain might be isolated. So bite threats, for example, especially related to saddling, are often related to ulcers. There's certain ways a horse will carry its tail. We have the ridden horse ethogram that tells us certain ways a horse will carry its tail, for example, that can be indicative of certain issues that are along the back. Long story short, though, we always want to get a vet to help rule out any underlying pain, mouth issues, saddle fit, things like that, before we move forward with a behavior modification plan. So meet their needs in management, make sure there's no pain involved, and then we look at the human animal interaction. So what is the handler doing in that space that could be triggering that behavior? Or what is happening in the environment or in that space that could be triggering that behavior? If we can change that, looking at the antecedents, right, rearranging those things that lead up to the behavior, then most oftentimes the behavior goes away and we know we don't actually have to focus directly on the behavior. But sometimes it does take training that horse or teaching that horse. Let me start over. Helping that horse feel differently about what's happening. It's not good enough to just change behavior. We have to change the way the horse feels about what's happening in order to truly get long-term behavior change. So kind of a long answer, but yeah, it's a lengthy process, Melanie. Great question. Thank you for that one. And okay, if itchy face neck is a sign of stress, are you in favor of allowing the horse to scratch their head on humans during the lesson? Melissa, this is a great question. I would say absolutely not. and first and foremost, usually an itchy face or neck that's related to a sign of stress, you're going to see it very chronically showing up in the exact same way. The horse that I can think of specifically, after every gait transition, she would drop her head and she would itch the inside of her left face on the inside of her left leg. And it was the same spot every single time. Almost stereotypic, right? Versus a horse that's learned that when I'm sweaty or itchy, I can rub on human and that feels pretty good. That's probably actually a pro-social behavior, and they enjoy doing that and not necessarily a sign of stress. But it's also a learned behavior that can be quite dangerous. They're 1,000 pounds, they can push a lot up against a human, and that can be dangerous. So great question. I think that there's probably two different things happening when a horse is trying to itch on a person versus that kind of self-itching that they'll do as a self-soothe with a release of tension. And the difference would be that chronic state that happens isolated without handler. They're really using that for themselves versus they're actually trying to itch because it feels good. In a long story short, Melissa, I love to teach my horses how to ask to be itched and then the appropriate way to take the itching. And that kind of goes back to my training with positive reinforcement. So what's really cool is you can actually teach horses how to accept an itching without kind of forcing it on you, stepping in your space and demanding it to happen. So I hope that kind of answers your question. Which that also tells me to reiterate that a lot of these behaviors in isolation could simply mean exactly what they seem to represent. So a horse itching their leg with their face, they just have an itchy face, right? Or a horse that's twitching his tail, there might be a fly or something that stimulated an itch response from the tail. And so, these acute behaviors are totally fine. It's okay if I see them a handful of times during sessions. What we really want to look out for are those chronic behaviors, those chronic indications. So what you all can do in practice, this is what my suggestion would be, when you have a problem behavior, let's say you have a horse that's exhibiting a problem behavior, whether it's failing to move forward at a cue or not stopping or walking too fast or, bite threading when you're trying to saddle them up, then you want to start looking and noticing for other signs of stress or tension. And that's going to help build your case around, yeah, there's something underlying going on here. And this isn't just a learned behavior that they're doing because they've been reinforced for doing it, if that makes sense. So those other indicators of stress by themselves may be nothing. It's when they're paired with chronic problem behaviors and chronic representations of those behaviors that we start to really worry about it. Or they start to be more diagnostic, I think would be a better way to say that. in our industry, horses are handled by lots of different people. Do you have a way to get input from all handlers on signs of stress? This is such a great question, Lindsay, and you're probing a real gap in what we need to do. So, to be quite honest with you, we need to have serious training for our handlers and probably even updated training for those that are getting equine behavior and handling training through like PATH certification, for example. Sharon Butler, who also works for CSU and is on the PATH board for equine welfare, her and I have been discussing the need to update sort of the evidence behind horse management and training, especially related to PATH certified instructors and any handler or any practitioner that's in this field. So yes, absolutely, handler training is the key, and that's something that really with just simple modifications of how people interact with horses, understanding how horses learn, understanding how to reinforce behavior, understanding when you accidentally reinforce the wrong behaviors, those are so important. And so yeah, the long-winded answer to your question is we need to have better training for our handlers, and more systematic, more of sort of a best practice, like a protocol that says everyone across our industry, these are the best practices in horse handling. And also everyone across our industry, these are the best practices in the tools that we use on our horses when they are engaged in these services, and understanding that the various tools we might use that have really been informed from traditional horse training, traditional horse practices, they might actually be shutting down behaviors that we need to see because those are those early signs of problems. And so I'd rather see us sort of unpack that than try and use tools to prevent the behaviors from happening. So yeah, I think that trainer handling is very, very important. A way to get input from all handlers. I just read that again, Lindsay. And so I do know that we have a postdoc student at CSU who's doing a survey with handlers. And there's another study that's actually just about to be published on the way handlers feel, volunteer handlers and paid handlers feel, like some of the experiences that they have in the interaction. And part of that is rein tension. I know they're looking at lead rope tension and stuff, and how that can be a struggle in some sessions. And so I'm excited to see the data on that. And then again, we have a postdoc student or a doctoral student, excuse me, who's going to be looking at specifically looking at handler experiences. So we need to do more research. Yes, I absolutely recommend period retraining or updates for handlers, Allison. I think that's a really great question. And I think part of what that training needs to be is where you have somebody that is watching the person in practice and able to point out ways to build on their skills. And what I mean by that is oftentimes we miss cues, we miss moments of reinforcement, or we actually create more stress to the horse in session because of things that we accidentally or unintentionally do. And so filming that, for example, filming the handler in practice so that the handler can go back and watch, oh my goodness, I noticed that when I did this, the horse did that. Building on their skills is really, really important. And also, the more we learn in the science about training, the more we can actually implement that in sessions as well. So yes, absolutely. Wand use in sessions for leading. So I think that horses that have to have tools for the session, it's just an increase of pressure, right, Allison? So when we're using a tool that says, hey, this is going to help keep our space, this is going to help reinforce you to move forward, this is going to help reinforce you to stop, or whatever we might be using the wand for, maybe it's to keep our space with that horse, there's a breakdown of communication in general. So what I would rather see is we go back to that horse and create a better learning history of reinforcement on cues from the handler and the emotional state of the handler, rather than moving for a tool. And the only reason I say that is if we're relying on the use of a tool to create behavior, to force behavior, then that tool is only as powerful as the hand that it's in. And so you can have it work really well for some people, and then the horse will start to push and lean on who really means this wand and who really doesn't mean this wand, if that makes sense. And so that's a disconnect between pressure release training, and that's a disconnect between steady reinforcement. And so we just want to make sure that we're not missing an opportunity to create more reinforcement history, stronger reinforcement history, rather than sort of saying, hey, I got the wand, so you need to make sure that you're paying attention. And if I'm understanding your question correctly, Allison, that would be my thought on that. Martha asks, if a therapist doesn't have a strong horse background, what are some good resources for foundational info? In my experience, each horse person has their own opinion on best ways to handle a horse or how they interpret the horse behavior. Martha, you are spot on. That's probably one of the biggest challenges I face in our industry. We really, when we look at every other species, the horse is behind every other animal when it comes to evidence-based practices for training and management. Dogs were right behind us, but they had a huge paradigm shift within the past decade about appropriate training practices in dogs. But horses, we still haven't quite figured out the art of bringing the science into training. The awesome thing that excites me is that your world, so this world, is very open-minded to novel training methods. And this is where we can do a lot of the research to show the rest of our industry that there are better ways of training that don't incite fear in horses and can create stronger connections and safer connections between horses and humans. So I would say that right now we're still building that good resource of information, but I would go to the International Society of Equitation Sciences website, and they're the leaders in equitation sciences research, where they're truly looking at learning theory and how that shows up in sessions, or excuse me, in human animal interactions. So go to the research, basically, right? Like there can be really great trainers out there that are really focused on behavioral indicators, but the best source is going to be our research. It's the International Society for Equitation Sciences, and they have a website, and on their website there's YouTube videos and current research that they've done. They've done some incredible research for the riding horse. Great resource. There's also a book that I would recommend. It's called Evidence-Based Horsemanship, and it's really written sort of in kind of layman's terms, but it's it's a neuroscientist and a horse trainer. They came together and wrote a book together. Horse Brain, Human Brain is another really good book that kind of shows sort of that comparative, like how horses and people, how similar we are as mammals. We have the same nervous system, same responses to trauma, same responses to emotions, but then showing the differences. So that's a really good one, a really good resource as well. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed it. And feel free to reach out to me. You can send me an email if you want to chat more. That's sarah.matlock@colostate.edu. sarah.matlock@colostate.edu. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Allison. Thanks, everybody.